Good afternoon. On behalf of the Nebraska Holocaust Commemoration Committee, I'd like to welcome all who have joined us here today. Please take a moment to silence any electronic device so as not to disrupt this solemn remembrance. Most importantly of all, I'd like to personally thank and acknowledge the dear souls that you see on my right at the front here, our beloved survivors. For it is their lives we honor today, as well as the souls of the millions of victims we remember at this, the week of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Week. The Nebraska Holocaust Commemoration is held in this beautiful room, our own state capitol's rotunda, to acknowledge the fact that the Holocaust was a state-sponsored atrocity, made legal by laws passed that gave permission to persecute, separate, and annihilate millions of Jews, Roma, political prisoners, mentally and physically handicapped, and homosexuals. We must continue to eradicate hate and bigotry in our world, regardless of its form. Our history shows that evil thrives when good people do nothing. It is our desire that every person here not only becomes educated about the past, but works to ensure a future where such hatred, prejudice, and bigotry will forever be eliminated. Because of the solemnity of this commemoration, we ask that there be no applause or any further recognition as we progress through our program. Our legislative representative today is Senator Megan Hunt. Senator Hunt represents District 8 and is serving in her first term. She earned her BA in Intercultural Communication in German in 2008 from Dana College. She is the founder of Hello Holiday and the founder and vice president of Safe Space Nebraska and co-founder of Majorette. Before that, she was the founder of Camp Co-working and Princess Lasertron. She's a member of Friends of Planned Parenthood and a trustee of Business Ethics Alliance and a former member on the board of Omaha Area Youth Orchestras. She was honored in 2016 by the Omaha JCs as one of 10 outstanding young Omahans. At this time, I will call to the podium State Senator Megan Hunt for a few remarks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Mr. Smith, thank you, Mr. Litkey, and to the Planning Committee for welcoming me here today. Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. Night by Elie Wiesel. Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. It was through my love of reading as a young girl in Blair, Nebraska, that the true history and the true tragedy and loss of the Holocaust was introduced to me 50 years later, 5,000 miles away, in the form of stories. From the book Number the Stars, I learned that of the almost 500 Jews deported to Theresienstadt, 449 of them survived, due in large part to the Danish government's intercession on their behalf. Among all the Nazi-occupied countries, only Denmark rescued the large majority of Jewish people. The Danish people and their elected officials showed that with a minimal amount of resistance to Nazi programs and deportations, their plans for genocide could have been obstructed. I have a lot of strong opinions about the direction our country's going in and the growing urgency that people today continue to develop their cultural competence and their historical literacy. That's because when we hear leaders in government all over the world and here in our country talking about immigrants as an infestation and animals and cockroaches, and these terms are not just used to describe people coming to our country, but Americans who are here today, that's Nazi language. That's the language of fascism. Using language about extermination to describe human beings has happened throughout history, but it's still happening here today. These aren't just words in our history books, it's happening now. And we know that because our eyes are open. I'm firm in my belief that if we forget the history of the Holocaust and its devastation of the Jewish people, if we don't stay connected to the love, compassion, and empathy that's here in this beautiful room today, our refrain of never again will not be a reality for future generations. For any young girl separated from her parents at the US border, just as some of you were separated from your parents in concentration camps and ghettos, for that young child, that is trauma, the scale of which fills her whole world. For the parents who don't know where their children are, who don't know if they're safe, that breaks something inside of you that slogans can never repair. We can't wait for the threat of fascism to get bad enough. What is bad enough to one person whose whole world is destroyed? The scale of the tragedy cannot matter. We must draw a bright line against fascism, discrimination, and hate wherever it rears its head and cut it off. If we leave it unchecked, hate can become both tolerable and ordinary. And when we deny the humanity of others, we extinguish it in ourselves. Our nation's epidemic of white supremacy is killing people. It's still killing Jewish people. It killed Jewish people last week. And people in positions of power need to recognize that and name that and decide collectively what we're going to do through policy changes to address that. From city councils to state legislatures to Congress, lawmakers can't see themselves as separate from the solution. A wholesale cultural shift needs to occur, including a firm and vocal rejection of white supremacy and white nationalism and anti-Semitism. And that's why I'm so happy and proud to be here today to welcome you to this important service. I'm so grateful to be part of a generation where I can learn firsthand about the atrocities of the Holocaust directly from the survivors, directly from people who survived it, who were targeted by it. And that's why I have my daughter here today as well, Alice, who's 8 years old, and it was important for me to bring her to have the same opportunity. You are the people today for whom life under fascism was a reality. To me, you stand as reminders of our violent past and witnesses of our violent present and motivation to stand up and show courage whenever freedom is in danger. They represent the moral courage that we are called upon to give and a reminder that there's no excuse to stay silent. The time comes to act, for good people to do the right thing, and we're living in it now. I thank you all, I love you all, and I welcome you to your state capitol. Thank you.
Next, we'd like to have our winning poetry students read their poem. First poem is called Before. Borisa Odenthal Lux is the person who wrote the poem. Unfortunately, she's not here, so we have a volunteer, Emma Feldman, who's going to read for her.
Before freedom, we were liberated. Before the liberation, we were marched. Before the march, we were tortured. Before the torture, we were prisoners. Before the prison, we were in camps. Before the camps, we were taken. Before being taken, we lived in ghettos. Before the ghettos, we were oppressed. Before the oppression, we had normal lives.
The last goodbye.
Make them stop, he called to me, but I refused to listen because now my own father had been consumed by madness. He was weak. He called to me again. It pained me that I didn't answer. He was making too much noise. Quiet over there, an SS officer yelled. My father never listened. He called my name, begging for water he couldn't have. Once, twice, again. The officer walked over. The officer dealt him with a violent blow on the head with his truncheon. But even with the pain, he called again through ragged breaths, my name. I was too afraid to move, much more to speak, so I stayed silent. There were no prayers at his grave, no candles were lit to his memory. His last word, my name, a summons, to which I did not respond. Was this how I had wanted to say goodbye to my father?
Like the moon.
We are standing, faces of the moon, passengers in history, desperately clinging to the moment in time that contains our existence, praying that it is not stolen away from us, all aware that someday, like phases of the moon, we will cease to be. The events of our era are like phases of the moon. Occurrences take place, a war, perhaps a brief glimpse of peace, yet nothing is permanent. All good, all evil will eventually fade away. The principles behind these events, however, remain. The Holocaust, for example, was fueled by ostracization. Though it may seem that this is no longer a problem, look around. Even during a crescent moon, when it seems to hang just a small sliver in the sky, the rest of the moon is still there. Even if the suffering of others is hidden from view, it is there, ever present, going simply through a phase of equality before vanishing. The phases of the moon repeat themselves. We cannot stop them from doing so. We can never fully stop anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, homophobia, or any other form of injustice. But it is our duty, our responsibility to try.
Thank you, students. Our keynote speaker this afternoon is no stranger to the field of Holocaust education. She is currently working on her PhD here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Beth is our former executive director and our first director ever of the Institute for Holocaust Education. And you can read more about her background after our service today. I have long considered Beth a strong advocate for social justice issues. I've considered her a mentor, a colleague, and most importantly, a very dear friend. At this time, I ask Beth Dotan to the podium.
Thank you, Paul. Senator Hunt, thank you very much for your amazing words, and I think I will be reflecting some of them here. And thank you all for being here today. It's been a long time since I've been in this rotunda, and I'm very, very honored to be back. On August 12, 2017, I was a guest at the UNL graduation at the Pinnacle Arena, a few miles from our beautiful capital. On this day, Mr. Roy Long, 93 years young, was to receive his honorary Doctor of Education. While a student at the University of Nebraska in 1943, Mr. Long's education and football career, he had set a new quarterback single-game national record of 258 all-purpose yards that stood until 2004. His education was interrupted when he was called to serve in the 71st Infantry Division of General Patton's 3rd Army. He was with the troops during the liberation of Gunskirchenlager concentration camp in Austria. As noted in the commencement program that afternoon, quote, "The images taken at Gunskirchenlager and the first-hand accounts of First Lieutenant Long and his fellow soldiers documented a terrifying picture of inhumane treatment and cruelty in the camps." As if this weren't enough for a young man in his early 20s, he also served guard for the American judges during the Nuremberg war trials, witnessing the hearings of Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess, leading members of the Nazi Party. Mr. Long continued his education upon return from Europe, married Charlene Joy Hoffman, and pursued a lifelong career in education and as a coach. He was called to serve again in the Korean War. Upon receiving his honorary degree, Chancellor Ronnie Green thanked Mr. Long for the many visits to Nebraska schools to speak to students after his classroom retirement. Quote, his eyewitness accounts helped Nebraska's youth understand the enormity of the Holocaust and to envision their role as citizens of the world who share responsibility for confronting crimes against humanity, end quote. But as the words of Mr. Long's legacy were shared with those gathered around at the ceremony that day, the phones of those around sitting in the bleachers began to vibrate. Charlottesville. Counter-protests to the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, began to escalate. Rally-goers were carrying long wooden clubs, punching and spraying chemicals. Although security officers stepped onto the scene and dispersed the crowds, a truck surged into a group of bystanders, killing Heather Heyer, 32, and wounding 19 others. How was it possible to make sense of this juxtaposition of yesterday and today at Mr. Long's graduation ceremony? Not too many years ago, I had listened to Holocaust survivor Joe Boyne, who had lived here in Lincoln, who grew up in Berlin and witnessed the Kristallnacht pogrom, as well as the growing Nazi fervor amid rallies and parades that spurred nationalism. In an Omaha Jewish Press article, Leo Biga wrote that Joe, quote, witnessed the mass public display of virulent anti-Semitic screeds, all meant to sway the Aryan citizens, to inflame hatred, to intimidate Jews and other supposed enemies of the state. I wanted to draw no parallels, but during that same weekend of the graduation at a neighborhood gathering, someone began to reference the First Amendment rights while defending white supremacist groups who claimed to be marching in Charlottesville in the name of freedom. I felt a surge of disbelief. I felt enraged. These emotions were unfamiliar despite my many years working in Holocaust education. I had built a shield and armed myself with the compassion and purpose in support of our Omaha and Lincoln Holocaust survivors, their families, and the liberators whose legacies deserved the utmost respect. I had not anticipated the uncomfortable emotion of anger. Charlottesville was nearly 2 years ago, but many names of killing sites just from the past 6 months are now buzzwords in the collection of unabashed violence targeting religious houses of worship, innocent people, and our democratic values. Pittsburgh, Louisiana, Church Christ, Sri Lanka, Poway, UNCC campus, communities whose sense of peace and security have been shattered with the unleashed hatred that has surfaced and has been accepted as the unfortunate norm. Have we become indifferent? Have we become unshockable? 74 years since the Soviets liberated Auschwitz. 81 years, an entire generation, since the first glass was shattered during Kristallnacht. Are we still, an entire generation, we are still negligent in educating our communities, our neighbors, our work colleagues, and most importantly, our children, that human destruction is a result of our own actions or lack of actions. The world in which we are charged to teach the lessons of the Holocaust today is a world of instability and confusion. So for a moment, we will take a look specifically at the issue of anti-Semitism today. The Anti-Defamation League defines anti-Semitism as, quote, the belief or behavior hostile toward Jews just because they are Jewish. It may take the form of religious teachings that proclaim the inferiority of Jews, for instance, or political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudice or stereotyped views about Jews. Unfortunately, the hatred of Jews is rooted in centuries-old historical contexts. Last Wednesday, May 1st, Tel Aviv University, the Cantor Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry, released its 2018 report on anti-Semitism worldwide. You may have heard fragments of this report through social media over the past few days. I would like to share a few of the highlights from this report. Number one, there is a sense of insecurity prevalent among Jews confirmed by the conducted studies. People of the Jewish faith do not always feel an integral part of their society in which they live. Number two, there has been a 13% rise in the number of major violent anti-Semitic incidents, bringing annual numbers to 387. There were 13 Jews murdered by acts of violence in this year, the largest number compared to previous years. And of course, we remember Lori Gilbert Kay, whose name we recall from Poway, California, who was shot down last community in her Chabad community synagogue on the last day of Passover. She was there to say the mourner's prayer for the memory of her mother. The report is a result of a study from several organizations that conducted interviews and surveys with nearly 50,000 individuals in more than 28 countries. Many incidents are never reported. Anti-Semitism is no longer a part of activists of extremists. It has become mainstreamed, and it is a constant presence in both the public and private spheres. On a more positive note, the report also mentions that anti-Semitism has been recognized by governments, multinational organizations, and leaders as a serious problem that needs to be confronted. The results of this report, appropriately released during the week of Holocaust commemoration worldwide, will settle and resonate in the coming weeks and months. It confirms warnings that attitudes expressing prejudice, hatred, and anti-Semitism are not just exercises of rhetoric, but are on the brink of becoming commonplace actions of violence. Have we become indifferent? Have we become complicit? Father Patrick Dubois, a French priest, whose organization Yachad in Unam, Together in One, has uncovered undocumented events of the mass murder of Jews in various Eastern European countries during the Holocaust. His organization is currently investigating the tribal genocides of the Myanmar Rohingya and the Yazidi in Iraq. Father Dubois has recently responded to the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism in contemporary Europe by saying this: "The Holocaust was not a tsunami. It came on slowly, and we did not see the signs. As I travel across the world, I see people are becoming more nationalistic, anti-Semitic, and intolerant. People are beginning to forget the lessons of the Holocaust. It is time for a major revitalization of history and education of past genocides if we are to navigate safely through these volatile times." End quote. Have we become indifferent? What does anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and genocide have to do with us, with me, with you? Among us in this rotunda today are survivors and their descendants who have made their home in Nebraska, as well as families of liberators who have come face to face with the unspeakable crimes committed during the Shoah. Each of these individuals has struggled and rebuilt a vital life, in our community. We are often unaware of how close our personal connections may be to these individuals. Can you imagine how they feel in today's environment? after fighting for their own survival, attaining freedoms to live among us in this country? Perhaps a glance at some of the astounding experiences of the survivors who passed away this year can be an inspiration to help banish the creep of compliance that is invading our space. Hani Bear Wolf, who resided in Albion, Nebraska for 68 years, was born in Ulm, Germany in 1925, where her father was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp on the eve of Kristallnacht. In the midst of Nazi rule and ever-growing anti-Semitism, Hani's mother was able to secure her husband's release, and later, after the Nazis confiscated their family business at the outbreak of the war, they searched for a way to reach America. Relatives were able to send an affidavit helping them to flee to America. In September 1940, by bribing officials, Hani's father arranged for the family to begin the arduous journey from Berlin to Moscow. But that was only the beginning. They continued to Manchuria, to Korea, Japan, British Columbia, and finally to Seattle. Through efforts they could not have achieved on their own, the family succeeded to defy a fate that so many others in Germany could not. Hani lived in Colorado with her husband, Bob Wolf, and later in Albion, writing a book about her experiences titled A Child of Two Worlds. Hani's son, William, lives here in Lincoln. Helen Mannheimer studied in Lithuania Jewish High School in Kovno, where, in addition to other languages studied, all subjects were instructed in Hebrew. Her life was turned upside down when the Russians entered Kovno. And under the Soviet-controlled government, her family's assets were depleted. As a result, Helen sought departure from Lithuania through the Japanese diplomat Chuni Sugihara. She was the only member of her family to obtain documentation needed for passage to Japan. She obtained a visa by the righteous act of Sugihara and was the only Sugihara person to live in Omaha in our midst. Ilse Hessel Kahn was born in a small town in Germany. With the rise of anti-Semitism and limitations of the basic human rights, her family also set their sights on refuge for the U.S. Through insight and quiet reserve, a man named David Kaufman, a Grand Island businessman and civic-minded individual, along with his sister, Theodora Kahn's family, set forth to rescue extended family in Germany with the paperwork necessary for immigration, among them the Hessels. From 1936 until the beginning of the war, Kaufman and the Kahns were able to secure affidavits for over 100 family members. Almost never speaking of their heroic deeds, the Kaufmans' foresight and action saved hundreds from the deadly jaws of the final solution. He regretted he could not save more. Ilse, who later married her distant cousin, Marcel, who was also sponsored by the Kaufmans, lived in Omaha and raised two sons. They would often say how lucky they were to live in America. They had the freedom to do as they wished, including to practice their Jewish religion. Hirsch Vladowitz was a proud father of 5 children. He and his wife, Paulette, of 70 years, raised their family in Omaha. Hirsch, having been snatched from his home in Poland at the age of 16 by the Nazis, survived the war after being interned in 7 camps, including Auschwitz. Hirsch searched for his family following the war, but no one survived. He met Paulette in Paris, his wife. They married and together started a family, later coming to Omaha. Like so many other survivors, starting a new life in a foreign country with a new language and no connections was a struggle. Despite their meager beginning, they found their way. Finally, I share with you a few thoughts regarding child survivor B. Karp, who tirelessly spoke to thousands of Nebraska school children for 55 years. Her astonishing story led her from Germany to camps in Vichy, France, and ultimately, due to her mother's courage and separation, to the protection by the Jewish underground and Catholic convents in the French countryside. She found her way to America after the war. On June 24, 1958, Bee took her test to be an American citizen. She said, and I quote, "If I don't cry, I was so proud to become a citizen. I have never taken for granted the rights and freedoms of this country," end quote. In 1963, in O'Neill, Nebraska, where she was living at the time, Bee took the Dale Carnegie course for public speaking and continued to speak until Wednesday, February 27th of this year, when she gave her testimony via the internet to the Walnut Middle School in Grand Island, Nebraska. 2 days later, Bee suffered a heart attack and died quietly with her children and grandchildren around her. We treasure the memory of those individuals mentioned here today: Hani Bear Wolf, Helen Mannheimer, Ilse Hessel-Kahn, Bee Stern Pappenheimer Karp, Hirsch Flatowitz, and yes, Mr. Roy Long, who lived among us in our communities but have died this past year. Today, my hope is that by sharing a small piece of their journey, we can reflect on how the actions of others who were not compliant can change lives. We too can strive to confront indifference in order to safeguard our freedoms. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, and I quote, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, not the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." Thank you.
Before I read you the bios of our survivors who are here and we begin our candle lighting ceremony for this afternoon, I'd like to recognize our Secretary of State, Robert Ebnen, who's here today, and we thank you very much for being here. I would first like to read our survivors' bios and then call them up as a group. Dr. Fred Cater was born in Antwerp, Belgium, and when he was just 4 years old, his mother had the foresight to send him away from the train station before deportation in the hope of saving his life. Found wandering in the streets, he was hidden in a convent and then a Jewish orphanage. He was the sole survivor of his immediate family. After the war, Fred was taken by extended relatives and living in Canada, and in 1974 moved to Omaha. Marcel Kahn. Observing the imminent danger in Germany, Marcel's family sought a way to America in 1938. As Beth told you, David Kaufman of Grand Island helped provide the necessary affidavit for him and his family to come to America, and Marcel, from that point on, grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. Paulina Lubinskaya. Paulina was born in Kukhan-Nishlach in the far eastern Uzbekistan in 1942. Her mother arrived in the city after a long and exhausting forced journey by cattle car from the small Moldavian village of Aldula Lika. During the journey, Paulina's older brother David and grandfather Samuel passed away. Paulina was 4 when the war ended. Her family was evicted from a community church where they had been living during the war, and they returned to a ruined and starving Moldavia. In 1999, Paulina immigrated to Israel and to Omaha in 2017. Kitty Williams. Kitty was born in Hungary in 1924. Her family's home was turned into a ghetto for the area's only 2 Jewish families before she was transported to Auschwitz. Kitty was later moved to Allendorf work camp, where she was forced to work with toxic chemicals and to chisel powder out of undetonated bombs. She was eventually liberated by the American Army and settled in Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1947, and she still lives in Council Bluffs. I'd like to call them forward to light candles. Right in front, please. I next would like to call Ari Cohn and Maureen Loeb to light candles. Ari is the grandchild of survivors, and Maureen is the daughter of survivor. Next, I'd like to call upon Bruce Crawford. He is the nephew of 2 liberators. A candle will be lit for all those around the world who have sought or are currently seeking refuge and asylum by leaving their countries of origin. And for that, we'd like to call upon Shireen Jardo Al-Hato, excuse me for mispronunciation, who is a part of the Yazidi population here in Lincoln, and Lacey Studnicka, who from Lutheran Family Services.
If you're able, please rise. El Malay Rachamim, Shochen Ba'meromim, Hametzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Ashchina, B'malot Kedoshim Utorim, Kezohar Harakia Masirim, Et Nishmot Kol Acheinu B'nei Yisrael, Shenitbechu b'Shoah, Anashim Nashim V'Taf, Shenechneku v'Shenisrefu, V'Shenehergu v'Shemasru, Et Nafsham al Kiddush Hashem, B'Gen Eden Tehi Menuchatam, Ana Ba'al Harachamim, Hastirem B'Seter Kenaftecha Le'olamim, Utzror B'Tzror Achayim, Et nishmotehem, Adonai hunachalatam, V'yanuchu v'shalom, Amishkavotehem, V'nomar, Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the souls of our brethren who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered, suffocated, and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives, and may their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. May they rest in peace. And let us all say, Amen.
First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. We read together. The cruelty, terror, and pain that human beings inflicted upon others whom they regarded as less than human. May we remember the victims, their lives and their deaths. For each human being is an entire world, and among the greatest obligations we have is to remember their names, even as their murderers sought to erase them forever. And we not only remember, but act now, in our time, to assure that never again will a repetition of the horrors of the Holocaust go unanswered.
This concludes our memorial commemoration. Thank you for joining us today.